Okay, so let's look at this aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, right? So basically, so we just bring them together. So we have learned why aggregate demand is a downward slope curve, and then why aggregate supply in the short run is upward slope, right? And so when we look at aggregate demand and aggregate supply, so in either case, we just take other side as given, right? So now we are going to bring them together. And so from bring them together, so we are going to see what determines price. And finally, so that's going to tell us what determines the equilibrium real GDP, right? So these two things cross each other. We are going to say, so the economy is in the short run macroeconomic equilibrium, right? And then you may just wondering, okay, so why not we are in the equilibrium here or here or here or here, right? So that's going to these are what we are going to learn, right? So you're going to see eventually the economy is going to settle here, at least in the short run, right? And so by the way, so here this YE is called short run equilibrium output, and the PE is short run equilibrium aggregate price level, right? So the economy in here, but there could be different shock to the economy, right? So because we have supply and we have demand, okay, and then there are positive and negative. Hence, there are a total of 4 different possible shock to the economy, right? So first, let's identify those 4 different shocks, and then later, so we are going to learn how the economy is going to respond to each shock. And from those discussions, you will understand so why we are able to reach the equilibrium. Okay, so start with demand shock. Okay, so this is if there's a negative demand shock, meaning so the total spending will fall. So on the graph, it just means so the aggregate demand curve will shift to left, right? And then so we are going to see a new equilibrium. Okay, and from a comparison between the new equilibrium with the existing equilibrium, what we're going to see is so the price will fall and the quantity will fall, or in other words, both aggregate price and aggregate output will decline after a negative demand shock. Okay, just to give you an example, so starting from spring of 2020, the economy suffers a negative demand shock, right? Because most of us are facing a lockdown, okay? And then so we can't consume or we can't spend, right? So in that sense, that's a negative demand shock to our economy. But certainly, so what happens in 2020 is more than a negative demand shock, okay? But there's negative demand shock aspect inside the current crisis. Right, so now look at other side of demand shock. It could be there's a positive shock, right? So the positive shock meaning so the demand will increase. So the demand curve shift to the right, right? So what can cause a demand shock, positive demand shock? Think about expectations, think about government policy, right? And so actually the government sent us a check. So that constitutes a positive demand shock, right? Whether it is effective or not, or whether it is necessary or not, that's a different question. But at least it is a positive demand shock because the government sent out a check and everyone has additional income, so you must have the incentive to spend. So then aggregate demand curve shift to right. Now similarly, we compare two equilibrium. Okay, what we observe is that after a positive demand shock, both price and aggregate demand or the equilibrium GDP increase, right? So this is demand side. Okay. Now, similarly, we can look at what happened if there's a supply shock. But again, so there are positive and a negative. Let's start with a positive supply shock. Okay. What is the positive supply shock? Say, for example, the decline in commodity price. Right? It's oil becomes cheaper, right? Like in the United States, so American find a cheaper way to extract oil from the rocks, right? That's a couple of years ago in North Dakota or in Oklahoma, right? So that's a positive supply shock. Or think about, so American find a better way to organize our workplace, or we discover new technology like internet, right? So that's considered as a positive supply shock. So a positive supply shock will lead an increase in aggregate supply. So the curve shift to right, right? Now we are going to enter a new equilibrium, right? And then, so again, so if you compare the new equilibrium with the existing equilibrium, what we observe is lower price, higher GDP. Okay. To finish this part, so we are going to see a negative supply shock. All right. So what is the example of negative supply shock? And again, so 2020 is a good example. All right. So 2020, because of the pandemic, because of lockdown, and then the supply chain get disrupted. Okay. I'm not sure how many of you play video games or how many of you are planning or already have a GPU, which is a graphic card. Okay. So I'm looking for a GPU myself, and I just recently find out so the GPU is very difficult to find and the price skyrocketed. Right? And what is behind this price change? So certainly one thing is because of the pandemic, and this supply chain disruption also has been exacerbated by the cold winter, right? Because lots of chips was made in Texas, and Texas got power down due to this bad weather, right? So that's a perfect example of negative supply shock, because the modern economy heavily relies on chips. Okay, so here I'm talking about computer chips, right? Okay, so this negative supply shock will move the aggregate supply to the left-hand side. Now similarly, we compare the equilibrium. We are going to see the price increase and GDP decline. Okay. Other example of negative supply shock is back in 1970. Okay. So there was a spike in oil price due to the geopolitical tension in Middle East. That's where most of the oil was produced back then, right? And the oil was considered as the engine of modern economy, at least in 70s. Now we have other source of energy. Okay, so that constitute a negative supply shock. Okay, so now, so before I move to the next slides, let me summarize what we have discussed. Right, so we look at demand shock, supply shock. Okay, so we have positive and a negative. Okay, so there are 4 possible shocks. Okay, so start with demand shock. If there's a positive demand shock, okay, and then so that's going to lead price increase, output increase. If it's a negative demand shock, price decline, output decline. Okay. On the other hand, if it's supply shock, if it's negative supply shock as we observed here, price increase, output decline. If it's a positive supply shock, price decline, output increase. Okay. So what we observe from this table are the following. Okay. So if we experience in demand shock, regardless positive or negative, what we know is, so the price and the output will move in the same direction. Now look at here and here. Okay, or in other words, so the demand disruption will lead to P and Y co-move in the same direction. Now if we look at supply shock, okay, and that's different story. So P and Y, they move opposite. They move in the opposite direction, right? So if price increase, output decrease. Price decrease, output increase. Right? So this is after supply shock, whether it's a positive or negative. Right? And so why this observation is important? So this is because, so in reality, when we examine our economy, first thing we need to know is, so the problem is caused by demand shock or supply shock. Okay? And so we need to identify the source of the shock so that we can come up appropriate government policy. By looking at this table and comparing with our actual economy, and we find out, or most economists believe, so most of our trouble is caused by demand shock, in the sense, if we look at historical data, price and the output usually move in the same direction. So that's a strong indicator. So most of our economic trouble was caused by demand shock. But certainly there are some time period, so we have a supply shock. But relatively speaking, demand shock are more common compared to supply shock. But I want to keep in mind, so this is particularly important when you move to more upper level of class, or eventually if you are interested in becoming a professional economist. Right? So I want to warn you, or maybe you want to keep in mind, so all the discussion relies on the correctness of the theory. Right? What the theory essentially summarized by this graph. Right? So, or summarized by the underlying things we just discussed. So this table, or this statement I just made, is correct even only if the underlying theory we learned so far is correct. Okay, but unfortunately this assumption is not unquestionable, right? But for now, for this class, for this principal class, we take it as truth. But in reality, or when you move to upper level of class, so you may see different opinions, or you see different theory, right? But for now, let's just take this as the only correct theory of our economy. right? But just please bear that in mind. Now, I want to emphasize there's a particular type of economic trouble, okay? So this is called stagflation. So stagflation is an event word. So this combine stagnant versus inflation. So this means stagnant means the GDP is not growing, so meaning Y is decline. Inflation means inflation, price increase, right? P increase. Now if you combine with previous slides, so essentially it's referring here, right? So price increase, output decline. So this stagflation. So this is pretty nasty. Okay, and usually this is caused by a negative supply shock. Okay, and usually it's very difficult to deal with, right? Okay, so now we're ready to look at long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. So this is, in some sense, this is a equilibrium of equilibrium, right? So earlier we talked about short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. So what is short-run macroeconomic equilibrium? So we have aggregate demand equal to short-run aggregate supply. So that's going to give you price and output, right? And then so what is long-run macroeconomic equilibrium? So this requires, so this Y equal to our potential. So by the way, here this is E, PE, right? So this is coming from the short run equilibrium. Now in the long run equilibrium, so you have additional restriction. You need YE equal to YP, right? And in the graph, just show here, right? So first, aggregate demand equal to short-run aggregate supply, right? And then so we achieve a short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, okay? And then so what is a long-run macroeconomic equilibrium? So we require, so the cross of these two lines generates a Y, and this Y equal to our potential. All right. So this is long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. Okay. And actually, so in reality, so we may have two other possibilities. Either the long run is on the left-hand side, okay, if this is your YP. And then, so what that means we are producing this in, so these two cross each other, right? So we are producing more than we potentially can produce. This is one possibility. The other possibility is we are here, long run. Now we are producing less than we potentially can produce, right? But for the rest of these slides, so I'm going to explain to you what caused this case or this case. And furthermore, I'm going to explain to you how our economy will respond. Okay. Right. So usually we are not in a long-run equilibrium is because there's some shocks, right? Either it's a demand or the supply shock. So there's shock hit the economy, and then so you're going to see, so there's a shift or there's a disruption away from the equilibrium, right? So now let's see what happens. Okay, so we start with long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. So that means, so the short-run equilibrium, which is the cross of these two lines, okay, generates the level of output. And then the level of output we generate from short-run macroeconomic equilibrium will be exactly equal to what we can potentially produce. Okay, now we are in the long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. Right. So, say for example, there's a shock to the economy, like what we experienced in 2020, and we are still experiencing that shock, okay, which is a negative demand shock. Okay, most of us were ordered to stay at home, okay, and the business was ordered to shut. And then there's a negative demand shock. The demand curve shift to left-hand side. Now you can see, so we are here temporarily, right? So now we are here temporarily. Now, compared to the original point, okay, so we have lower price, we have lower output, right? And actually, we call this a recessionary gap. Why is that? It's because so we produce less than we potentially can produce, right? So usually this means so the business lay off because the demand isn't enough, right? So the business can't sell their stuff, right? Because there are not enough customers to purchase the goods and services we produce. Okay, we are in a recession. Now you may be wondering, or you may ask yourself, what will happen next? Okay, now just remind yourself what we discussed earlier. So now we are in a recession, and then this means the unemployment is going to be high, right? Because the business lay off. Why they lay off? Because the demand is weak. Okay, business lay off, unemployment high. Now unemployment high meaning there are many people looking for job. Okay, if people are looking for job, or there are lots of people looking for job, what would that mean to wage? Okay, so that's a question so we need to think about. But certainly, if there are many people looking for job, and the job are very limited, and then so what people are going to do? So they're willing to work for lower wage. That means the business, they can reduce the wage, but they still can attract a certain amount of worker, right? Okay, now if that's the case, so the wage decline, so that means what? So that means the aggregate supply. So okay, next step. The short run aggregate supply will increase, right? And why the short run aggregate supply will increase is because the wage falls. But why wage falls is because there's a high unemployment. Why there's high unemployment is because business lay off. But why business lay off is because there isn't enough demand. Okay, but there isn't enough demand, so that's the starting point of our story, right? So there is some shock to our economy. Right? Now let's just forward looking. Okay, so now we are here. So short run aggregate supply will increase, right? So due to the response from the economy. So that means so the curve will shift to the right, and that means eventually we will back to the long run equilibrium. Okay, so in other words, so first we move from E1 to E2, and then so because of the aggregate supply will increase as a response to change in labor market. Okay, and then so we move from E2 to maybe called E3. All right. Okay, so to summarize this part, So somewhere this part. Okay. So we start with a negative demand shock. Okay. So this negative demand shock will push down the aggregate demand curve. Price falls. Output falls. Right? And so as a consequence, the unemployment rate will increase because the business lay off. So unemployment increase, and then so the economy will respond, right? And then in the labor market, the nominal wage will decline, not because there are many people looking for jobs. So but if the nominal wage decline, so that will becomes a positive shock to aggregate supply. Hence, the aggregate supply will shift to the right, and eventually we reach a new equilibrium. Right? Okay, so I'm going to stop here for today, and then in next class, so we will look at what will happen if there's a positive demand shock. Right? So the discussion here will prepare us to understand the role of government can play in this recession, or conversely, maybe we're in an expansion, right? Okay, thank you so much for your attention, and see you next week. And do not forget the weekly assignment on Canvas, right? Also, next week we're gonna have our third midterm, meaning next week, Thursday, we will have our review. All right, thank you.